2 years after burying her husband, she received a shocking call from the hospital. "Ma'am, your husband has been in an accident. He's in the ICU. Please come immediately." Frozen in disbelief, she rushed to the hospital, only to come face to face with the impossible. A very, very powerful story. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Stories. Every heartbeat of this journey has been filled with your love. You stood beside me through every story, every silence, every tear and smile. You are not my audience. You are my family, my comfort, and my reason to keep going. Today, I lift my hands in prayer. May the Almighty bless every woman with unshakable strength, endless grace, and the courage to rise above every storm. May every man carry a heart full of wisdom, patience, and devotion. May every home glow with peace, laughter, and unity. May your days overflow with blessings, your nights rest in calm, and your hearts be guarded by divine love forever. If your heart is true, like the video, if your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." Beth Money was cataloging medication errors in the Sacred Heart Hospital database when the emergency doors burst open, bringing in the usual Thursday night parade of minor traumas and major inconveniences. She didn't look up immediately. She had 43 more entries to review before her shift ended. And her coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago. Her feet ached in shoes, held together with surgical tape at the seams. The same pair she'd been wearing for 18 months because every spare dollar went to her mother's medications or the rent on their studio apartment that smelled perpetually of disinfectant and declining health. She was calculating whether she could afford to replace them this month or next when someone said her name. Not someone asking for nurse money or calling out for assistance, but someone recognizing her, saying Beth like it was a word they'd been holding in their mouth for years. The voice belonged to a patient on a gurney, neck immobilized in a cervical collar, being wheeled past the nurse's station toward Trauma Room 3. He had turned his head as far as the collar allowed, grey-blue eyes finding hers with the peculiar intensity of shock or medication or something else entirely. Those eyes were the color of Lake Michigan during a November storm, and they looked at her like she was the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. The paramedics were already moving him away, calling out vitals and mechanism of injury, rear-ended at a stoplight, possible whiplash, alert and oriented ×3. But the patient kept his eyes locked on hers until the trauma room doors swung shut between them. Beth sat back down and returned to her error logs. But her hands had developed a subtle tremor that made typing difficult. The screen blurred slightly, and she realized she was holding her breath. Marissa, the charge nurse, who noticed everything because noticing everything was how you survived 20 years in emergency medicine, appeared at her shoulder with the kind of casual concern that meant she was actually worried. "You okay, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Fine, just tired. You know how it is. Mom was up most of the night again." This was true, but not the truth. Her mother had been restless, calling out for Beth's father, who had been dead for 15 years, but that wasn't why Beth's hands were shaking. She had no logical explanation for the way her body had responded to that stranger's voice, saying her name. The way every cell had suddenly come alert like she'd touched a live wire. Dr. Ashworth was running behind. A multi-vehicle accident had just arrived, and he was the only attending physician on until midnight. So Beth was assigned to the rear-end collision patient's initial assessment. She gathered supplies methodically, using routine to steady herself, blood pressure cuff, pulse oximeter, the standard paperwork that reduced human complexity to checkboxes and signatures, little bureaucratic attempts to contain the vast messiness of bodies and pain. She paused outside Trauma Room 3, took a breath that went all the way down to her diaphragm, and entered with her professional face carefully arranged. He was sitting up on the exam table when she entered, the cervical collar already removed and set aside. "Mild muscle strain," he said before she could speak. "I'm fine. The paramedics overreacted, but I needed to come here." His voice was educated, careful, with the particular softness of someone who had learned to minimize their presence in rooms where they didn't belong. She recognized it because she had the opposite problem. She'd learned to make herself larger, louder, impossible to ignore in rooms that wanted to dismiss her. "We still need to do a full assessment," Beth said, moving with practiced efficiency, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm. His sleeve was expensive fabric, the kind that felt like water under your fingers. "Can you tell me your name?" "James Franklin Frank Jim." He watched her face carefully as he said it, and she had the strange feeling he was cataloguing her features the way she catalogued symptoms, methodically, looking for patterns and meaning. "March 15th, 1991. I'm 33 years old, single, graduate degree in comparative literature that I'm not using because I'm helping run a company I never wanted to inherit. I live alone in a house too big for one person and spend my evenings reading poetry no one else cares about and writing things I'll never show anyone." Beth looked up from her clipboard, startled by the rush of unnecessary information. "That's very thorough, Mr. Frank. Jim, please. And I wanted you to know. I needed you to know who I am." There was an urgency in his voice that didn't match the minor nature of his injury. "I realize how strange this sounds, but I saw you and felt like I recognized you. Not your face exactly, but something essential. Like I'd been looking for you without knowing I was looking. Did you hit your head in the accident?" Beth kept her voice clinical, but her pulse had quickened. "Sometimes trauma can cause—" "No, and I'm not confused or disoriented. Actually, I feel oriented for the first time in my life." He smiled then, a crooked expression that transformed his serious face into something younger, more vulnerable. "Is that a medical emergency? Sudden onset clarity? It's not typical for a minor collision." Beth touched his wrist to check his pulse, and he inhaled sharply at the contact. She pretended not to notice, but she felt it too. A current passing between them that had nothing to do with static electricity. His pulse was elevated but steady, and she counted beats against her watch while trying not to think about the warmth of his skin or the way he was looking at her like she was something precious he'd lost and found again. "Your hands are cold," he said softly. "Poor circulation. Runs in my family, along with stubbornness and the inability to quit things that are bad for us." She didn't know why she added that last part, except that something about him made her want to be honest, in a way she usually wasn't with anyone, except her mother at 3 a.m. when the pain was too bad for pretense. "What else runs in your family?" His question was gentle, genuinely curious, rather than making small talk. Diabetes, depression, the tendency to love people who leave. She looked at him sharply, surprised by her own confession. "Are you experiencing any confusion, disorientation? Because you seem to be having an unusual effect on my professional boundaries. I'm having the opposite of confusion. I feel clear for the first time in years. Is that unusual?" He shifted slightly when she moved to check his other arm, and she caught a hint of his cologne, something subtle and expensive that probably cost more than her monthly groceries. But underneath it was just the human smell of him. Soap and skin and something indefinable that made her want to lean closer. They talked while she documented his vitals, not the usual patient chatter about symptoms and insurance cards, but real conversation that felt dangerous in its depth. Jim told her about discovering James Wright in college, reading "The Branch Will Not Break" in his dorm room, and crying because he finally found words for the disconnection he'd always felt from his family's world of hostile takeovers and profit margins. Beth admitted she'd wanted to be a writer once, before her father's death and her mother's illness, and the relentless mathematics of survival had demanded more practical choices. "What would you write about?" Jim asked, and the question felt more intimate than if he'd asked her to undress. Nothing important. Just the way fluorescent lights make everyone look like they're dying a little. How you can tell the exact moment someone stops fighting their diagnosis and accepts it. The specific weight of grief. You can actually measure it in the slope of shoulders. Did you know that? Grief has physical mass. It changes how people occupy space. That sounds like the most important thing anyone could write about, Jim said quietly, and Beth had to turn away because his sincerity was too much, too real in a place where she'd learned to armor herself in professional distance. Dr. Ashworth arrived eventually, performed a perfunctory examination with the exhausted efficiency of someone who'd seen too many bodies to be truly present for any individual one. He prescribed muscle relaxants Jim would never fill and discharged him with instructions to follow up with his primary care physician. The visit should have ended there. Jim should have walked out of Sacred Heart and become another forgotten face in the endless stream of Thursday night. Patients who passed through Beth's life, leaving nothing but paperwork and occasionally interesting stories. For the break room, instead, he lingered at the nurse's station while Beth finished her charting, pretending to read discharge instructions while obviously waiting for her to look up. When she finally did, he had the expression of someone about to jump off a cliff and hoping there was water below instead of rocks. "I know this is inappropriate," he said. "I know you probably have policies about this, but would you have coffee with me? Real coffee, not whatever that is." He gestured at her cold cup with its film of separated creamer floating on top. "Just coffee. Just talking. I can't explain it, but I feel like if I walk out of here without some way to see you again, I'll be making the worst mistake of my life." "I don't date patients," Beth said automatically, though her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, a rhythm she would have been concerned about in anyone else. "I'm discharged, technically no longer a patient, and it wouldn't be a date. Just two people who've read James Wright, having coffee and talking about poetry and the physical weight of grief." He pulled out his phone, showed her a photo of his bookshelf. Poetry collections dominated 3 shelves: Neruda, Oliver, Clifton, Haas. "I have no one to talk to about any of this. My family thinks literature is what you study to have interesting conversation at charity galas. My colleagues think poetry is what you quote in wedding toasts. I've been so lonely, I sometimes feel like I'm disappearing, becoming less solid every day. And then I saw you and felt real again. That has to mean something." Beth looked at the books, then at his face. There was something raw in his expression, a loneliness that echoed her own so precisely it felt like looking in a mirror. She thought about her life, work, mother, sleep, repeat, a cycle that would continue until something broke, probably her. She thought about the last time someone had looked at her and seen Beth instead of a nurse or a caregiver or a problem to be managed. "One coffee," she heard herself say. "Tomorrow morning. Brennan's on 5th Street, 9 o'clock. And if you quote Neruda at me before I've had caffeine, I'm leaving." She would think later about fate versus coincidence, about the mathematical probability of Jim choosing that exact moment to glance away from his phone, causing the collision that brought him to Sacred Heart on the one night she was working that particular station. At the exact time, she was vulnerable enough to say yes to coffee with a beautiful stranger who read poetry. She would wonder if some forces were inevitable, like gravity or the way water always finds its level, like the way two people could recognize each other before they'd actually met. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Falling. Jim arrived at Brennan's 37 minutes early and changed tables 3 times before settling on one by the window where he could see Beth approaching, but the light wouldn't be directly in her eyes. He had slept 90 minutes total, spending the rest of the night reading Ada Limon and Billy Collins and trying not to think about the way Beth's hands had felt, checking his pulse. A clinical and gentle and somehow the most intimate touch he'd experienced in years. He'd brought a book, The Carrying by Ada Limon, then left it in his car, then retrieved it, then left it again, paralyzed by the fear of appearing either pretentious or empty-handed. Beth was 6 minutes late and apologizing before she even sat down, slightly out of breath, her hair escaping from a ponytail in ways that suggested she'd been running. "My mother's home health aide didn't show. I had to wait for the backup and she got lost. And then Mom had an episode where she didn't recognize me and tried to call the police because a stranger was in her house. And she stopped abruptly, color rising in her cheeks. I'm sorry. You don't need to hear all this. I want to hear all of it. Jim stood awkwardly, uncertain of the etiquette. Handshake? Hug? He settled for pulling out her chair, a gesture that made her smile in a way that suggested she was trying not to laugh. Too much? Very gallant. Like something from a novel where everyone dies of consumption. But she sat down with a grace that made the wooden chair look elegant. Do you always pull out chairs for women? My mother's influence. She believes in proper manners and improper politics. She once served tea to the governor on her best china while explaining why his education policy was, and I quote, criminally negligent and morally bankrupt. She thinks civility and cruelty can coexist. She's probably right. Beth ordered black coffee and a sesame bagel, and Jim noticed her quickly counting the bills in her wallet before deciding. The kind of mental math he remembered from graduate school before family money made such calculations irrelevant. He wanted to offer to pay, but sensed that would break something fragile between them, would establish a dynamic that would change everything that came after. Tell me about your mother, he said, then caught himself. Sorry, that's probably too personal for coffee between strangers who just happen to read the same poets. We're not strangers. You're the patient who mysteriously knew my name before I told you. She was teasing, but also not, her eyes searching his face for an explanation he didn't have. That was deeply weird, by the way. The good kind of weird, or the restraining order kind of weird, I haven't decided yet. I can't explain it. I saw you and your name was just there in my mind, like remembering something I'd forgotten I knew. He paused, aware of how insane that sounded. The good kind of weird, I hope. My mother has advanced MS, Beth said, answering his earlier question with the kind of abrupt topic change that suggested she didn't want to examine the connection between them too closely yet. She was diagnosed 10 years ago, but it's progressed recently. She lives with me, which is challenging in a studio apartment. She used to be a teacher, high school biology, and now she can barely hold a pencil. Some days she's completely lucid, and we have these amazing conversations about everything, from cellular mitosis to Victorian poetry. Other days she thinks I'm her sister who died in 1987. Your turn. Tell me about your family. Jim found himself telling her things he'd never articulated before, words coming out like water through a broken dam. How his father, Howard, had built Frank Industries through methods Jim suspected were unethical, but had never been able to prove, a suspicion that lived in his chest like a stone. How his brother Wesley had absorbed their father's ruthlessness like a genetic inheritance, viewing empathy as weakness and kindness as a luxury they couldn't afford. How his mother Diane performed elaborate social calculations. Every relationship a transaction, every kindness strategic. Every word chosen for maximum impact rather than truth. Example, Beth said, spreading cream cheese on her bagel with the precision of someone used to making resources stretch. Give me a specific example of your mother's strategic kindness. Last month, she donated $1 million to a children's hospital, not because she cares about sick children. I've never seen her interact with a child except to critique their posture, but because the hospital was naming a wing after someone who snubbed her at a charity auction in 2003. She literally bought her way into permanent proximity to her enemy. The donation will help kids, sure, but that's incidental. The real purpose was to ensure this woman has to see my mother's name every time she visits her namesake wing. That's genuinely disturbing. Beth took a bite of her bagel, considering. Also kind of brilliant in a supervillain way. And you? Jim asked, needing to steer away from his family before their dysfunction poisoned this fragile new thing. Where do you fit in your family ecosystem? I'm the last one standing. She said it simply, without self-pity. Dad died when I was 18. Heart attack at work. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. My brother David overdosed 4 years ago. Fentanyl in what he thought was Percocet. Mum's dying slowly, system by system, and I'm trying to make it as dignified as possible while working 60-hour weeks and pretending I'm not drowning." She looked up at him, her dark eyes direct. "I'm telling you this because if we're going to be friends or whatever this is, you should know I'm not a project to be saved or a tragic character in need of rescue. This is my life. It's hard, and it's mine, and I'm not ashamed of any of it." "I don't want to save you," Jim said carefully. "I want to know you. There's a difference." They talked until Brennan's filled with the lunch crowd, and their waiter began hovering with increasing obviousness. Jim wanted to suggest another location, another day, another lifetime of conversations. But Beth had to get home for her mother's afternoon medications and the elaborate ritual of helping her to the bathroom without destroying what remained of her dignity. "Can I see you again?" Jim asked as they stood outside in the noon sun that made Beth's hair reveal hidden auburn undertones he wanted to memorize. "I work nights, sleep days, take care of my mother in between. I exist in the spaces between normal life." She said it like a warning. "I have infinite flexibility and chronic insomnia. I exist in spaces too. Maybe they're adjacent." He knew he sounded desperate and didn't care. "Please, I haven't talked to anyone like this in maybe ever." She studied him with those dark eyes that seemed to see through his expensive clothes and careful manners to something more essential underneath. "Friday, 3 a.m., I have a break. Hospital cafeteria. And Jim, don't fall in love with me. I don't have room in my life for that kind of disaster." "Too late," he said, then immediately wanted to take it back, but Beth was already walking away, and he stood on the sidewalk, watching her disappear into the crowd, feeling like he'd just stepped off a cliff and discovered he could fly. Chapter 3. The Velocity of Truth. Their second meeting in the hospital cafeteria at 3 a.m. involved vending machine sandwiches that tasted like disappointment and a philosophical debate about whether suffering was essential for. Beth argued that comfort bred complacency, that the best poetry came from wounds that wouldn't heal. Jim countered that joy deserved documentation too, that Elizabeth Bishop wrote about happiness as complexly as she wrote about loss. They were both right and both wrong, and somewhere in the argument their knees touched under the table and neither of them moved away. "You don't understand," Beth said, peeling the plastic wrap off a sandwich that claimed to be turkey but looked like beige sadness between bread. "When you grow up with money, even your suffering has a safety net. You can afford to have a breakdown. You can check into somewhere peaceful and call it a wellness retreat. When you're poor, suffering is just Tuesday, and you still have to show up for your shift on Wednesday." "You're right," Jim said, and she looked surprised. "I don't understand. Not fully. But I want to. And my suffering might have a safety net, but it's still real. Different doesn't mean less valid. What do you suffer from?" She asked it gently, genuinely curious rather than challenging. The weight of inherited expectations, the guilt of unearned privilege, the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people who only see your function, not your face. The knowledge that my family's wealth comes from other people's misery, and I benefit from it every day, he paused, then added more quietly, the fear that I'm too weak to break away, that I'll die in the life they built for me instead of building my own. Beth reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were cold from the vending machine drinks, but her grip was firm. "You're not weak. Weak people don't question their circumstances. They don't stay awake wondering if they're good enough. They just accept and consume and never think about the cost. How do you know I'm not just another rich person having an existential crisis between trust fund deposits? Because you're here. At 3 a.m. in a hospital cafeteria, eating terrible food with someone you barely know, instead of at home in what I imagine is a very comfortable bed." She squeezed his hand once before letting go. "That's not nothing." Their third meeting was Beth showing him the hospital's roof access, using a key card she technically wasn't supposed to have. They sat on the concrete edge, legs dangling over 8 stories of empty space, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of amber and rose. Beth told him about the patient who died during her shift, a 17-year-old named Amy who'd overdosed on purpose, leaving a note that just said, "I'm tired." Her parents kept saying they didn't understand, Beth said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and something heavier. They had given her everything: private schools, therapy, a car for her 16th birthday. They kept listing things they'd bought her, as if that was the same as knowing her. But I understood. Sometimes the weight of being alive is so heavy, you'd do anything to put it down, even if putting it down means putting yourself down permanently. Have you ever felt that way? Jim asked carefully. Every day from ages 16 to 19. I used to sit in my car in the high school parking lot, engine running, trying to decide whether to drive home or drive into the median on I-94. The median started looking more attractive every day. Then my mother got sick, and I couldn't afford that particular luxury anymore. She turned to him, and in the early morning light, he could see the exhaustion written in every line of her face. When someone else needs you to keep existing, you lose the right to stop. You, currently. Except when I'm here. He meant the hospital, but he also meant with her, in this bubble they'd created outside their regular lives. My family has my entire life mapped out. Marriage to someone appropriate, which means wealthy and connected. Children to carry on the family name. My gradual consumption by the company until I'm just another Frank who chose money over meaning. I can see it all stretching ahead of me like a prison sentence. And some mornings I think about how easy it would be to just not. To take all my sleeping pills at once and opt out of the whole performance. But you don't. But I don't, because I'm a coward. No! Beth's voice was fierce. Living when you don't want to is the opposite of cowardice. It's the bravest thing there is. Every morning you wake up and choose to keep going despite the weight is an act of rebellion. She kissed him then, sudden and fierce, tasting like hospital coffee and sleeplessness and something desperate. It was nothing like the careful choreographed kisses Jim had experienced before, the polite meeting of mouths that felt like shaking hands. This was drowning and breathing at the same time, falling and flying, ending and beginning. When they pulled apart, Beth looked terrified. "I can't do this," she said, already backing away from the edge, from him, from the vertigo of what had just happened. "Why?" "Because you're going to realize I'm just a tired nurse from a bad neighborhood who can barely keep her life together. Because your family will find out and make you choose, and blood is always thicker than whatever this is. Because this kind of thing doesn't happen to people like me." "What kind of thing?" "The kind where everything changes. The kind that makes you believe in fate or God or cosmic significance. The kind that ends with someone getting destroyed, and it's usually the person with less power." She was crying now, angry tears she wiped away impatiently. "I've worked in an ER for 5 years. I know how stories like this end. The rich boy doesn't choose the poor girl. That's just in movies and books written by people who've never been poor." "This isn't a story," Jim said, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Everything felt narrative, charged with meaning, like they were already in the third act of something that had started before they were born. "It's just us. There is no just us. There's you with your trust fund and your poetry degree, and your family who owns half the city. And there's me with my mother who's dying, and my studio apartment with roaches, and my shoes held together with tape. We're not from different worlds, Jim. We're from different universes. Then let's build a new universe, one where none of that matters. You really believe that's possible?" She was looking at him like he was either a miracle or a delusion, and she hadn't decided which. "I believe the fact that we found each other means something. I believe your name appearing in my mind before you told me means something. I believe this feeling." He pressed his hand to his chest, where his heart was doing something unprecedented, means something. And I choose to be brave enough to find out what. They fell into each other after that, with the inevitability of dropped objects finding the ground. Jim rearranged his entire life around Beth's night shifts. Arriving at the hospital at 2 a.m. with real food, Thai from the only place open, sandwiches he'd made himself with bread from the expensive bakery his mother frequented. Once an elaborate spread of cheese and fruit that made the night shift, nurses treat him like visiting royalty. He learned Beth's rhythms, when she could steal 20 minutes, when she needed silence, when she needed him to make her laugh with terrible medical puns. He looked up specifically to crack her exhausted facade. Beth started leaving poetry on his windshield, lines from Neruda copied in her spiky handwriting. Mary Oliver passages about attention being the beginning of devotion. Lucille Clifton celebrating the big hips she would need for birthing. Once she left an original poem that made Jim sit in his car crying, "For 10 minutes, you are the disruption I prayed for, but without knowing I was praying. You are the flood that drowns the life I built from compromises. Let me go under. Let me breathe water. Let me learn a new way of living in the space between drowning and swimming." 2 months in, Jim was helping Beth with her mother, lifting her from bed to wheelchair with a gentleness that made Beth fall in love with him in a way that transcended romance. Beth's mother, on her lucid days, would look at Jim with eyes that held too much knowledge and say, "You're going to break each other's hearts," and neither of them would deny it, because breaking meant they had something whole to begin with. 3 months in, they were making love in Beth's narrow bed while her mother slept in the next room, trying to be quiet but failing because their need for each other had its own volume that couldn't be muted. Jim traced the exhaustion lines around Beth's eyes like they were sacred text. Beth mapped the tension in Jim's shoulders, the physical evidence of carrying a life that didn't fit. They memorized each other's bodies like studying for an exam, where failure meant returning to lives that would feel like death after this much aliveness. Chapter 4. The Unraveling of Careful Things. The pregnancy test showed 2 lines on a Wednesday morning in October, the bathroom light harsh and unforgiving as Beth sat on the edge of her bathtub, staring at undeniable evidence that their careful world was about to collapse. She'd known for a week, probably. The exhaustion that went beyond her usual tiredness, the nausea that coffee couldn't explain, the tenderness in her breasts that made her wince when she put on her scrubs. But knowing and knowing were different things, and the 2 pink lines were the kind of knowing that changed everything. Jim was at a board meeting he couldn't miss, something about quarterly projections that he'd explained apologetically while kissing her goodbye that morning. Beth held the test and tried to imagine telling him, tried to picture his face cycling through surprise, fear, and then what? Joy, panic, the careful blankness of someone realizing they've been trapped? She thought about not telling him. She could handle this alone, had handled everything else alone before he'd crashed into her life with his poetry and his gentle hands and his dangerous hope that love could overcome structural inequality. But that felt like the kind of lie that would poison everything. And they'd built something too precious to poison with a mission. Her mother was having a good day, sitting up in her wheelchair, working on a crossword puzzle with handwriting that barely resembled letters anymore. She looked up when Beth entered, and her eyes, still sharp despite everything failing around them, went immediately to Beth's face and then to her stomach in a way that made Beth wonder if mothers ever lost the ability to read their daughters' bodies. "How far along?" her mother asked simply. "Maybe 6 weeks." Beth sat on the floor beside the wheelchair, suddenly 12 years old again, needing her mother to tell her everything would be okay, even though they both knew better. "Mom, what am I going to do?" "You're going to have a baby. And that boy is going to have to choose between his family and his child. And either way, you're going to survive because that's what we do." Her mother's hand, shaking with tremor she couldn't control, found Beth's hair and stroked it gently. "Do you love him?" "With everything I have. Is everything you have enough?" "I don't know." "Then you'd better find out before this baby makes the question irrelevant." Jim came over that night with takeout from the good Chinese place and a bouquet of bodega, flowers that were already wilting, but that he presented with such earnestness Beth almost cried. He could tell something was wrong immediately. 3 months of learning each other's frequencies meant hiding had become impossible. But he waited until after dinner, until after her mother was settled for the night, until they were sitting on her fire escape watching the city pretend to sleep. "Tell me," he said simply. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. Jim's face went through exactly the progression Beth had imagined. Surprise, fear, and then something else. Something that looked like awe. "Say something," Beth whispered. "Marry me." "That's not Jim. Be serious." "I am being serious. Marry me. Not because of the baby, although yes, also because of the baby. But because I was going to ask you anyway. Because I can't imagine a life without you in it. Because you make me brave enough to be the person I want to be, instead of the person I was built to be." He turned to face her fully, his eyes bright with an intensity that was almost frightening. "I know it's too fast. I know we're from different worlds. I know my family will implode. I don't care about any of it. Marry me, Beth. You haven't told your family about me yet. I'll tell them tomorrow. They'll destroy us. They'll try. Jim, do you love me?" "Oh, you know I do." "Then that's all that matters. Everything else is just logistics." But logistics, Beth knew, were where love went to die. Logistics were bills and insurance and custody agreements. Logistics were the reason her father had worked himself to death and her brother had turned to pills. Love was the luxury. Logistics were the reality. But looking at Jim's face, the desperate hope mixed with determination, she let herself believe for a moment that maybe they could be the exception. "Ask me again when your family knows," she said finally. "Ask me when you understand what you're actually choosing." The next evening, Jim put on his best suit, the one his mother had chosen for last year's charity gala, and drove to his family's estate with Beth beside him. She'd wanted to wait in the car, but Jim insisted she come in. "We face them together or not at all," he'd said. And the set of his jaw suggested this wasn't negotiable. The Frank mansion sprawled across 3 acres of manicured perfection, every blade of grass exactly the right height, every flower chosen for maximum impact rather than beauty. Beth had seen it from the outside during one of her late-night drives when she couldn't sleep. But walking through the front door felt like entering a museum where touching anything would trigger alarms. Diane Frank stood at the top of the marble staircase like she'd been posed there, wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Beth made in 6 months. Howard emerged from his study with the careful movements of someone who'd had 2 drinks, but was pretending to have had none. Wesley appeared last, taking in Beth's presence with a calculating look that reminded her of doctors deciding whether a patient was worth saving. "Father Wesley," Jim said, his voice steady, though Beth could feel his hand trembling where it held hers. "This is Beth Money, the woman I love, the mother of your grandchild." The silence that followed had physical weight, pressing against Beth's chest until breathing became conscious effort. Diane descended the stairs slowly, each click of her heels on marble, sounding like a countdown to execution. "I see," she said finally, her voice so controlled it could have been discussing the weather. "And how long has this situation been developing?" 3 months, Jim said. "The best 3 months of my life." 3 months. Diane repeated it like tasting something rotten. "And you're certain the child is yours?" "Don't!" Jim's voice carried a warning that made even Wesley take a step back. "Whatever you're about to say, don't. I'm simply asking logical questions." This woman, Diane looked at Beth the way someone might examine a stain on expensive carpet, appears from nowhere, attaches herself to you, and now claims to be carrying your child. Forgive me for finding the timing suspicious. The only suspicious thing here is how quickly you jumped to the worst possible assumption, Jim said. Beth didn't attach herself to me. If anything, I pursued her. She tried to maintain professional boundaries. She warned me this would happen. And I didn't care because being with her is the first real thing I've done in my entire manufactured life. Howard finally spoke, his words careful and measured. Son, you're emotional. That's understandable, but emotions pass. Consequences don't. This woman, Beth, her name is Beth. Beth, then. She seems lovely, but she's not from our world. She doesn't understand the responsibilities that come with being a Frank, the obligations, the expectations. You mean she hasn't been trained to prioritize money over meaning, Jim said. She hasn't learned to smile while destroying people. She hasn't mastered the art of polite cruelty. You're right, she doesn't belong in your world. Which is why I'm leaving it. Wesley laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. With what money? You think you can support a family on poetry and good intentions? You think she'll still love you when you can't pay for her mother's medical bills? Beth found her voice finally, surprising everyone, including herself. I've been paying my mother's medical bills for 10 years. I've been supporting myself since I was 18. I don't need Jim's money or yours. What I need is for you to stop talking about me like I'm not standing right here. Diane turned her attention to Beth fully for the first time, and Beth understood what small animals felt like when hawks circled overhead. You're very pretty, Diane said, making it sound like an accusation. And I'm sure you're very good at your job, but you have no idea what you're asking my son to sacrifice. The life he would have with you would be small and hard and ultimately disappointing. Is that really what you want for him? I want him to be happy, Beth said simply. Something he's never been in this house. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Diane's carefully composed face cracked slightly, showing something raw underneath before she pulled herself back together. I'll make you a deal, she said, her voice returning to its controlled register. Stay here for 2 weeks, both of you. Let us get to know Beth properly. Let her see what Jim would be giving up. And then, if you still want to throw your life away, at least you'll do it with full knowledge of the cost. Jim started to refuse, but Beth squeezed his hand. She knew a trap when she saw one, but she also knew that running now would mean always running, always wondering if they could have faced this and won. Fine, Beth said. 2 weeks. Chapter 5. The Slow Poison of Compromise. Living in the Frank mansion was like being slowly suffocated by silk. Everything was beautiful and soft, and designed to make breathing just difficult enough that you noticed, but not so difficult that you could complain. Beth was given a room in the East Wing, close enough to Jim's childhood bedroom, to maintain the fiction of propriety, but far enough that she felt isolated, cut off from the one person who made this bearable. The room itself was larger than her entire apartment, with a bathroom featuring Italian marble and fixtures that probably cost more than her annual salary. The bed was so soft she couldn't sleep, used to her lumpy mattress that had trained her spine into specific accommodations. She would lie awake listening to the house settle. These expensive sounds, nothing like the sirens and arguments and music that provided her usual nighttime soundtrack. Diane waged her campaign with surgical precision. Breakfast was at 7 sharp, requiring Beth to be presentable in a way that meant waking at 6 to shower and attempt to make her hair and face meet whatever invisible standard was being applied. The first morning, Beth arrived in her best dress, the one she wore to job interviews, and Diane's smile made it clear she'd already failed. "How charming," Diane said, managing to make the word sound like an insult. "Jim, perhaps you could take Beth shopping today. She'll need appropriate attire if she's going to be attending family functions." "Beth looks perfect," Jim said firmly. But Beth could see the exhaustion already starting in his eyes, the weight of fighting battles on multiple fronts. "Of course she does," Diane agreed smoothly. "But surely she'd be more comfortable in something suitable for the occasions she'll be attending as your partner." The shopping trip was humiliating in ways Beth hadn't anticipated. Not because the saleswomen were rude, they were professionally friendly in the way of people working on commission, but because Jim had to pay for everything, turning her into exactly what his family had accused her of being, a woman who needed a man's money. She stood in dressing rooms, trying on clothes that cost more than her mother's monthly medication, watching herself disappear under layers of appropriate fabric. "You don't have to do this," Jim whispered, while a saleswoman went to find another size. "We can leave right now and let them win?" Beth straightened the jacket of a suit that made her look like someone playing dress-up. "No, I can survive 2 weeks of this." But surviving meant small compromises that accumulated like toxins. It meant sitting through dinners where Howard discussed business deals that destroyed neighborhoods like hers, describing them as urban renewal opportunities. It meant watching Wesley treat the household staff like furniture, never making eye contact or saying please or thank you. It meant Diane's constant corrections, her posture, her pronunciation of certain words, the way she held her fork, all delivered with a smile that suggested she was being helpful. "Tell us about your family," Diane said one evening, after 3 glasses of wine had sharpened her cruelty. "Your father was a janitor, wasn't he?" "Maintenance supervisor," Beth corrected, though she knew Diane knew the correct title. "He kept office buildings running. Made sure people had clean, safe places to work. How noble." "And your brother?" Beth felt Jim tense beside her. "David died 4 years ago." "Oh?" Diane's eyebrows rose in practiced concern. "Illness?" "Overdose." Beth kept her voice level. "Fentanyl-laced pills. He was 22. How tragic. Addiction is such a difficult disease. It must have been challenging having an addict in the family." "He wasn't an addict." Beth's voice came out sharper than intended. "He had a back injury from working construction. His doctor cut off his prescription without tapering him down or offering alternatives. He bought what he thought were regular pills because he couldn't afford another doctor visit and couldn't afford to miss work. One bad decision in a moment of desperation doesn't make someone an addict." "Of course not," Diane said smoothly. "I'm sure he was a lovely person. Such a shame when people make poor choices." Beth wanted to throw her wine in Diane's face, wanted to scream that David had been brilliant and funny and kind, that he'd taught her to ride a bike and checked under her bed for monsters and called her every Sunday even when he was struggling. But she swallowed the rage because that's what Diane wanted. An explosion she could point to as evidence of Beth's unsuitability. Wesley was subtler in his approach, cornering Beth when Jim was pulled into meetings he supposedly couldn't miss. "You know this is temporary, right?" he said one afternoon, finding her in the library trying to read while her stomach churned with morning sickness that lasted all day. "Jim's had these episodes before, these attempts at rebellion. He always comes back to who he really is. And who is that? A Frank. Someone who understands that feelings are lovely but irrelevant when it comes to real life. He'll realize eventually that love doesn't pay medical bills or private school tuition. And when he does, where will that leave you? With a child who knows they were wanted," Beth said. "Which is more than you can say." Wesley's face darkened. "You think you're clever. You think you've won something, but you're just another obstacle to be managed, and this family is very good at managing obstacles." The stress was affecting her physically. She could barely keep food down, but throwing up during Diane's carefully orchestrated meals would be seen as weakness or manipulation. She hid saltines in her pockets, excused herself to bathrooms where she could vomit quietly, covered her exhaustion with makeup Jim's money had paid for. Her mother called daily, but Beth couldn't tell her the truth, that she was drowning in enemy territory while carrying a child who might never know peace. Jim tried to protect her, but he was fighting his own battles. Howard had suddenly discovered urgent problems at multiple Frank Industries subsidiaries, requiring Jim's immediate attention. Diane had a series of social obligations that Jim couldn't miss without causing the kind of gossip that would damage the family's standing. Wesley had their corporate lawyers reviewing Jim's trust fund terms, looking for clauses that could be weaponized. They managed to steal moments together, late nights in Jim's room, when the house was asleep. Early mornings walking the grounds before the surveillance of family breakfast. But even these felt tainted, observed, performed for an audience that might not be present but always felt possible. "We're losing," Beth said one night, lying in Jim's childhood bed, surrounded by evidence of who he'd been before her. Tennis trophies, debate certificates, photos from European vacations she couldn't imagine affording. They're wearing us down exactly like they planned. No, Jim said, but his protest lacked conviction. We're proving we can endure this. Enduring isn't the same as living. And what about when the baby comes? Do you want our child growing up in this toxic atmosphere? Being taught that cruelty is sophistication and money matters more than meaning? Of course not. But if we leave now, they'll use it against us. They'll say we couldn't handle real life, that we're not stable enough to raise a child. They have judges who owe them favors, social workers they've donated to. They could make our lives impossible in ways we haven't even imagined yet. Beth knew he was right. The Frank family's power extended far beyond this mansion, into courtrooms and boardrooms and agencies that were supposed to protect people like her, but somehow never did. They were trapped between staying and being slowly poisoned or leaving and being systematically destroyed. On the 10th day, Diane played what she clearly considered her winning move. She'd arranged a family dinner with extended relatives and business associates, the kind of event that required Beth to perform appropriateness for 3 hours straight. Beth wore the most expensive dress Jim had bought her, arranged her hair the way the salon had taught her, smiled until her face ached. She was doing well until dessert, when Diane stood to make a toast. To family, Diane said, raising her glass. To understanding where we come from and where we're going. To knowing that some things, breeding, education, shared values, matter more than temporary feelings. She looked directly at Beth. And to those who understand that loving someone sometimes means letting them go back to where they belong. Beth stood up so quickly, her chair scraped against the floor. The room fell silent, 20 pairs of eyes turning to her with expressions ranging from pity to barely concealed delight at the drama. You're right, Beth said, her voice carrying clearly through the dining room. I don't belong here. I don't belong in a place where people measure worth by bank accounts and bloodlines, where kindness is weakness and cruelty is called civilization, where you can sit at a table that costs more than most people make in a year and discuss destroying neighborhoods like they're monopoly properties. You're absolutely right. I don't belong here. She turned to Jim, whose face had gone pale. But neither do you. You never have. And staying here, trying to prove something to people who will never see you as anything but a disappointment, is killing the person I fell in love with. So I'm leaving, tonight. You can come with me or stay here, but I won't watch you disappear into their world anymore. Beth walked out of the dining room with as much dignity as she could manage, leaving behind shocked whispers and the clatter of Diane setting down her champagne glass with enough force to crack the crystal. Chapter 6. The Violence of Separation. Beth made it to the guest room before the shaking started, adrenaline and rage making her hands tremble as she threw clothes into her bag without folding them, shoving the expensive dresses in with her old jeans in a tangle that felt like rebellion. She could hear raised voices from downstairs. Jim's voice, sharp with anger, Howard's low and threatening, Diane's cutting through both with surgical precision. The sounds carried through the mansion's perfect acoustics, designed to impress but now serving as an amphitheater for family destruction. She was zipping the bag when Jim burst through the door, his face flushed and eyes wild with something between panic and determination. His tie was askew, pulled loose in what she recognized as his gesture of extreme distress. Don't leave, please, not like this. Not when we're so close to winning. Winning? Beth laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. Is that what you think this is? A game with points and victory conditions. Jim, look at yourself. Look at what 2 weeks in this house has done to you. You're disappearing into their world, syllable by syllable, and I can't watch it happen anymore. We only have 4 more days. 4 more days of what? Of your mother dissecting my family's tragedies over 5-course dinners like she's performing an autopsy for entertainment. Of your brother explaining why I'm genetically inferior using pseudoscience he learned at Harvard. Of your father looking through me like I'm temporary, like I'm a phase you'll grow out of. She continued packing, grabbing toiletries from the bathroom, her hands moving with desperate efficiency. Every day I stay here, I lose a piece of myself. And every day you stay here, you become more like them. You're transforming into exactly what you swore you'd never be. That's not true, isn't it? Yesterday, you didn't defend me when your mother said people from my neighborhood have different values, like poverty is a moral failing instead of a systemic injustice. Last week, you agreed with your father that the company's expansion into low-income housing was complicated, when we both know it's predatory, when we both know they're destroying families like mine for profit margins. She turned to face him fully, seeing how her words landed like physical blows. You're so busy trying not to rock the boat that you don't notice you're drowning. You're so focused on playing their game that you don't realize they've already won because they've got you playing at all. Jim sat heavily on the bed, his head in his hands, and for a moment he looked exactly like the exhausted warehouse worker he would become, though neither of them knew that yet. I'm trying to protect us, to protect our child. If we leave now, they'll come after us with everything they have. They have judges who owe them favors, journalists who spike stories for them, social workers they've donated to. They could take our baby, Beth. They could actually take our baby. They're already taking our baby by making us live like this, by forcing us to pretend we're people we're not. What kind of life is this for a child? Growing up surrounded by people who see them as either an heir to corrupt or a mistake to hide. Beth sat beside him, taking his hand, feeling the calluses that would soon replace his soft skin. Jim, I love you. I love the person you are at 3 a.m. reading Neruda in my terrible apartment with sirens going off outside and the neighbors fighting through the walls. I love who you are when you're helping my mother with her exercises, patient and gentle even when she doesn't remember your name. I love who you are when you forget to be a Frank. But that person is dying in this house, suffocating under good manners and proper place settings, and if we stay, there won't be anything left to save. Where would we go? His voice was small, scared in a way that broke her heart. My apartment tonight, we'll figure out the rest tomorrow. We'll be poor, but we'll be ourselves. Beth, your apartment is... He stopped, but she could fill in the blanks, could complete the sentence with all the adjectives he was too polite to say. Too small, too dangerous, too poor, too much like the life our child will actually have if you choose us over them. She stood, resuming her packing with movements that had turned angry. If you can't handle my apartment, then you can't handle me. Because that apartment is my life, Jim. It's not a temporary embarrassment before we move up in the world. It's where I live, where I've survived, where our child was conceived. If you're ashamed of it, you're ashamed of me. Before he could answer, the door opened without a knock. Privacy was another thing money could buy, apparently. Diane stood there with Wesley behind her, both of them wearing expressions of calm triumph that made Beth's stomach twist with the kind of nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. They looked like prosecutors who'd just found the evidence they needed, like hunters who'd cornered their prey. Leaving so soon? Diane asked, her voice honeyed poison. How unfortunate. I had hoped we could come to a more civilized arrangement, something that would benefit everyone. There's nothing civilized about what you've been doing, Beth said, her voice steadier than her hands. Civilization doesn't mean crystal glasses and knowing which fork to use. It means treating people with basic human dignity, something this family seems incapable of. On the contrary, I've been extraordinarily civilized. I've welcomed you into my home despite your background. I've dressed you appropriately, since you clearly had no suitable clothing. I've introduced you to our society, though you've failed to appreciate the opportunity. The fact that you're unsuited for it isn't my fault. It's simply genetics and upbringing, manifesting as they always do. Mother, stop, Jim said, standing, his body positioning itself between Beth and his family without conscious thought. We're leaving. Both of us, tonight. I don't think so. Wesley stepped forward, holding a tablet like it was a weapon, which in their world it was. See, while you've been playing house, playing at love, conquering all like this, is some romance novel, I've been investigating Ms. Money here. Did you know she was arrested 3 years ago? Beth's blood went cold, ice spreading through her veins as she recognized the ambush. Those charges were dropped for shoplifting baby formula. Wesley turned the tablet toward Jim, showing a police report that had been highlighted and annotated like evidence in a trial. Hardly the behavior of someone fit to raise a frank heir. What kind of person steals baby formula? The kind who sees a baby hungry and acts, Beth said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest like a physical pressure. I was picking it up for my neighbor. Her boyfriend had left, she had no money, and her baby was crying from hunger. She asked me to get formula and said she'd pay me back. I forgot to pay because I got a call that my mother had fallen and was being taken to the hospital. When I realized my mistake and went back to pay, they'd already called the police. The charges were dropped because the store manager reviewed the footage and saw I clearly wasn't trying to steal. I was distracted by a phone call about a medical emergency. Nevertheless, it shows a pattern of criminal behavior, Diane said smoothly, like she was discussing the weather rather than destroying someone's life. Combined with your family history of addiction, your unstable living situation, your inability to provide proper health care. Well, any family court judge would have concerns about your fitness as a parent. My family history of addiction. Beth laughed, the sound dangerous. My brother took pain pills because he was injured doing actual work. The kind that builds the buildings you own, but never visit. That's not addiction, that's desperation. But you wouldn't understand the difference because you've never been desperate for anything except attention and status. You're threatening to take our baby. Jim's voice had dropped to something dangerous, something neither Beth nor his family had heard before. I'm suggesting that Beth consider what's best for the child, Diane replied, unmoved by his tone. A generous financial settlement, enough to care for her mother properly, perhaps even purchase a small home in a better neighborhood, in exchange for allowing the baby to be raised with the advantages only we can provide. Joint custody, of course. Visitation rights. Very generous, really. You want me to sell you my child? Beth's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. You actually think I would trade my baby for money? You think that's what this is about? I think you're smart enough to recognize reality, Diane said, her eyes cold as winter storms. You can struggle to raise this child in poverty, watching them miss opportunities, unable to provide proper education or health care or even basic safety. Or you can ensure they have everything while also securing your mother's care. It's really quite generous. Most women in your position would be grateful for such an offer. Get out, Jim said quietly, the words carrying more weight than shouting would have. I beg your pardon? Diane's eyebrows rose in practiced surprise. Get out! His voice was louder now, filling the room with a rage Beth had never heard from him. Get out of this room. Get out of our lives. And if you ever threaten Beth or our child again, I will destroy everything you've built. I'll go to the press with every dirty deal, every bribe, every corner cut. I'll provide documentation for every building code violation, every tenant you've illegally evicted, every safety regulation you've ignored. I'll burn Frank Industries to the ground and salt the earth so nothing ever grows there again. You wouldn't dare, Howard said from the doorway. Apparently, the whole family had come for the show, drawn by the prospect of Beth's humiliation. You don't have the stomach for that kind of war. You never have. You're weak, James. You always have been. That's why you need us to make your decisions for you. Try me. Jim moved to stand beside Beth, taking her hand, their fingers interlocking with desperate strength. I died inside every day for 33 years, trying to be the son you wanted. Trying to earn love that was always conditional, always just out of reach, always dependent on being someone I'm not. But Beth brought me back to life, and our child deserves better than this mausoleum of greed and cruelty you call a family. So here's what's going to happen. We're leaving tonight, right now. You're going to let us go. And if you come after us, if you so much as drive past Beth's apartment, if you make one phone call to interfere with our lives, I will unleash hell on this family in ways you can't imagine." "With what resources?" Wesley sneered, but Beth could see uncertainty in his eyes for the first time. "You think your trust fund will last long supporting a family? You have no real job, no skills beyond reading poetry and feeling sorry for yourself. You'll come crawling back within 6 months." "You're right," Jim said simply, and his agreement clearly surprised them. "I don't have much. I don't have job skills or connections or any of the things you value. But I have something you'll never have, someone who loves me for who I am, not what I can provide. Someone who sees me as a person instead of a bank account or a disappointment or a project to be fixed. And that's worth more than every dollar this family has stolen over the generations." He turned to Beth, his eyes bright with unshed tears and determination. "Pack everything, we're going home." "This isn't over," Diane said, her composure finally cracking to show the rage underneath, the fury of someone who had never been defied so completely. "You think you can just walk away from this family? From your responsibilities? From everything we've built for you?" "My only responsibility is to Beth and our child," Jim said, already helping Beth gather the last of her things. "The family I choose, not the one I was cursed with. The family that loves without conditions or contracts or strategic value." They left 10 minutes later, Beth's bag and the few things Jim grabbed from his room thrown hastily into the back of his car. As they drove away from the mansion, Beth looked back once at the lit windows that made the house look like a jack-o'-lantern, all hollow light and menacing grins. She saw silhouettes in the windows, the Frank family watching their departure, like generals observing a tactical retreat, already planning their next attack. "They won't let this go," she said quietly, one hand resting protectively on her growing belly. "I know." Jim's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched with tension that would become his permanent expression in the months to come. "They'll make our lives hell. They'll use every connection, every resource, every dirty trick. Probably. Jim, are you sure?" He pulled over abruptly, turning to face her fully in the dim light of street lamps that illuminated his face in planes of shadow and determination. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You are my family, you and our baby. Everything else is just noise. Everything else is just obstacles to overcome." They drove to Beth's apartment in silence, both processing what had just happened, what it meant, what came next. When they parked outside her building, with its graffiti and broken streetlight, and the sound of someone's music playing too loud at midnight, Jim looked up at it, like he was seeing it for the first time. Really seeing it, not through the lens of his privileged life, but as what it was, a place where real people lived real lives without apology. "It's not much," Beth said, suddenly self-conscious about the peeling paint and the smell of garbage from the dumpster and the woman arguing with someone on her phone in language that would have made Diane faint. "It's everything," Jim replied, and she could tell he meant it. "It's real. It's honest. It's ours." They climbed the 3 flights of stairs, Beth's key sticking in the lock the way it always did, requiring the specific jiggle she'd mastered over years. Her mother was asleep in the hospital bed that took up half the living space, her breathing labored but steady, the oxygen machine humming its mechanical lullaby. The apartment smelled like the lavender oil Beth used to mask the scent of medication and illness, like the coffee that was always brewing because sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford, like life being lived despite circumstances that suggested life shouldn't be possible here. "Welcome home," Beth whispered, and when Jim pulled her close, she could feel him shaking, with relief or fear or maybe both. They stood in the doorway holding each other, 2 people who had just declared war on one of the city's most powerful families, armed with nothing but love and the desperate hope that it would be enough. Outside, the city continued its restless movement, unaware that in a tiny studio apartment, two people were about to learn what it really meant to choose each other over everything else the world said mattered. Chapter 7. The Weight of Consequence. Liddy's first month in Beth's apartment was an education in poverty that no amount of Jim's theoretical understanding could have prepared him for. He learned that hot water was a limited resource that required strategic planning. Beth's mother needed help bathing at 7 a.m. when the ancient boiler was most reliable, which meant Jim and Beth took turns with abbreviated showers that sometimes ended in shocking cold. He learned that the cockroaches weren't a sign of poor housekeeping, but of systemic neglect by landlords who knew their tenants had nowhere else to go. He learned that the police sirens that punctuated their nights weren't abstract symbols of urban decay, but specific tragedies happening to real people just blocks away. But mostly, he learned about the mathematics of survival, the complex calculations Beth performed every day without conscious thought. They sat at her tiny table, really a card table she'd found on the street and reinforced with duct tape, while she showed him how $43 needed to stretch for 5 days. 18 for her mother's medications that insurance didn't fully cover. 10 for gas to get to job interviews that never resulted in callbacks. 8 for the laundromat because the building's machines had been broken for 3 years. 7 for food, rice, beans, the bruised vegetables from the discount market that needed to be used immediately. That left nothing for the prenatal vitamins Beth needed, so she'd skip them this week and double up next week if money was better, though it never was. "This is impossible," Jim said, staring at the numbers that refused to add up no matter how many times he rearranged them. "The math doesn't work." "The math never works," Beth replied, matter-of-fact in the way of someone who'd long ago stopped expecting miracles. "That's why people like us are always in debt to someone. Payday lenders, credit cards with criminal interest rates, family members who can't afford to help but do anyway. Poverty charges interest on everything, even survival." Jim's job search was an exercise in humiliation dressed up as opportunity. His resume, impressive in certain circles, was almost useless in the real world where Beth lived. His poetry, degree from an elite university, might as well have been written in a dead language for all the good it did him. He applied for teaching positions, but they wanted classroom experience and teaching certificates he didn't have. He applied for office jobs, but he was simultaneously overqualified and underexperienced, a paradox that meant automatic rejection. His family name, which had always opened doors, now seemed to close them. Either people recognized it and wanted nothing to do with Frank Industries' legacy, or they didn't recognize it and wondered why someone with such fancy education wanted to work for $15 an hour. After 3 weeks of rejection, he finally got overnight shifts at a warehouse in the industrial district, loading trucks from midnight to 8 a.m. for barely above minimum wage. The hiring manager, a man named Carlos with tired eyes and hands that had done real work, looked at Jim's soft hands and clean clothes with barely concealed skepticism. "You ever done physical labor?" Carlos asked. "No," Jim admitted. "You running from something? Cops, debts, angry ex?" "My family." Carlos laughed, short and bitter. "Aren't we all? You start tonight. Don't be late, don't complain, and don't quit without notice. We clear?" Clear. That first shift was a revelation in pain. Jim's body, accustomed to nothing more strenuous than occasional tennis at the country club, screamed in protest as he lifted boxes that seemed to gain weight as the night progressed. His back spasmed, his hands blistered, then bled, the gloves he'd been given offering minimal protection against the constant friction. By 4 a.m. he was moving in a haze of exhaustion, so complete it felt like drowning in air. When Carlos found Him sitting on a pallet, unable to stand for a moment, he expected to be fired. Instead, Carlos handed him a bottle of water and 2 ibuprofen from his own pocket. "Gets easier," he said simply. "Or you get harder. Same difference." Jim came home that first morning to find Beth awake, her face drawn with the particular exhaustion of first trimester pregnancy. She'd been up all night with her mother, who'd had an episode of confusion and tried to call Jim's name, not understanding who he was, but sensing he was important to her daughter. "My hands have never been this dirty," Jim said, looking at his palms with something between wonder and despair. They were black with grime that seemed to have settled into every line and whirl of his fingerprints, marking him as someone who did real work now. "Now they're honest hands," Beth replied, taking them gently in hers and leading him to the bathroom, where she'd laid out bandages and antibiotic ointment she couldn't really afford. She cleaned his wounds with the practiced efficiency of a nurse, wrapping his palms carefully while he tried not to whimper at the sting. Beth's own job search had hit a wall that had Diane Frank's fingerprints all over it. Every hospital in the city suddenly had hiring freezes. Private clinics never returned her calls. Even home health agencies, desperate for workers and usually willing to overlook almost anything, somehow found reasons Beth wasn't suitable. The blacklisting was surgical in its precision. She could probably get work 1 state over, but they couldn't afford to relocate, couldn't leave her mother's doctors, couldn't abandon the fragile network of survival they'd built. "They're trying to starve us out," Beth said, after another fruitless day of applications. "Make us so desperate we come crawling back." "Then we don't crawl," Jim said, though his body ached in ways that made even walking feel like surrender. "We find another way." The other way came from Mrs. Chen, the elderly Chinese woman who lived 1 floor down and seemed to know everything that happened in the building before it happened. She appeared at their door one evening with a covered dish that smelled like salvation and a proposition that sounded like dignity. "You need work," she said to Beth without preamble. "I need someone reliable. I run cleaning service, cash only, no questions. Is hard work. Not glamorous, but is honest money. I'll take it," Beth said immediately. "Is not easy with baby," Mrs. Chen gestured at Beth's still small belly. "Lots of bending, chemicals, heavy equipment. You sure?" "I'm sure." The work was brutal on her pregnant body. Beth spent nights cleaning office buildings after the workers had gone home, pushing vacuum cleaners that seemed heavier every day, scrubbing toilets while fighting morning sickness that lasted all day, using industrial chemicals that made her nausea worse despite the masks Mrs. Chen provided. Her back ached constantly. Her feet swelled until her shoes, the same taped-together ones, barely fit. But it was cash in hand every night, invisible to whatever systems the Franks were monitoring, enough to keep them afloat if barely. Jim found additional work through one of his warehouse colleagues, a man named Derek who dealt with rich kids' problems for cash. Specifically, he connected privileged teenagers with tutors who could guarantee improved test scores. The irony wasn't lost on Jim. The same families who would never accept Beth were paying him under the table to help their children reach schools like the one he'd attended, to perpetuate the very system that was currently crushing them. $100 an hour, Derek explained. Cash! You go to their houses, make their kids marginally less stupid, collect your money. Don't fuck their moms, don't steal their shit, don't talk about what you see. Easy. It wasn't easy. Jim would finish his warehouse shift, sleep 3 hours, then drive to mansions that reminded him of his parents' house to tutor teenagers who complained about problems that would have been luxuries in Beth's world. They whined about their parents' expectations while Jim thought about Beth cleaning their parents' offices at night. They stressed about which Ivy League school to attend, while Jim wondered if his child would be able to afford community college. One student, a girl named Madison, whose father owned several buildings in Beth's neighborhood, complained that her parents were literally ruining her life by insisting she maintain a B average to keep her car. "Do you know what real problems look like?" Jim asked, his patience finally snapping after 4 hours of her complaints. Real problems are choosing between insulin and electricity. Real problems are working 3 jobs while pregnant because someone blacklisted you from your profession. Real problems are watching your mother die slowly while you can barely afford to make her comfortable. Madison stared at him, shocked into silence. Then quietly she said, "I didn't know there were people who actually lived like that." "There are millions of us," Jim said, the use feeling strange but right in his mouth. "We're just invisible to people like you." He expected to be fired, but Madison's scores improved dramatically after that conversation, and her mother recommended him to 3 other families. The money helped, but the psychological toll of existing in both worlds, loading trucks with men who were 1 injury away from homelessness, then teaching children who spent more on coffee than those men made in a day, was eating at Jim in ways he couldn't articulate. Beth understood without words. She'd come home from cleaning office buildings where single desks cost more than their annual rent, her body aching, and find Jim staring at nothing, trying to reconcile the different versions of reality he inhabited. They'd hold each other in their narrow bed, while her mother's breathing machine provided a mechanical rhythm to their silence. Both too exhausted to speak, but needing the confirmation that someone else understood this impossible existence. Her mother's condition worsened as Beth's pregnancy progressed, as if she was holding on just long enough to know her grandchild would exist. The confusion episodes increased. She called for Beth's father more frequently, for David, for people long dead. But on her clear days, she was still the sharp woman who'd raised Beth to be strong. And she watched Jim with eyes that saw everything. "He's changing," she told Beth one afternoon while Jim was at the warehouse. "The soft parts are wearing away." "Is that bad?" Beth asked, though she'd noticed it too, the way Jim's gentleness was calcifying into something harder, more defensive. "Not bad. Necessary. But don't let him lose all the softness. The world needs people who stay tender despite having every reason to harden." She paused, her breath laboring. "You're both being forged by this. Make sure you're forged into something worth becoming." The 20-week ultrasound should have been a celebration, but they almost missed it because they couldn't afford the copay. Jim had to choose between the ultrasound and getting his wisdom tooth pulled. It had been aching for weeks, but dental work was a luxury now. He chose the ultrasound without hesitation, living on ibuprofen that barely touched the pain. They sat in the waiting room of the community clinic, surrounded by other women who looked like Beth, tired, pregnant, worried about money. The receptionist called names with the bored efficiency of someone who'd seen too much desperation to let it affect her anymore. When Beth's name was finally called, they walked back together, Jim limping slightly from a back injury he'd gotten at the warehouse that he was pretending didn't exist. The technician, young and relentlessly cheerful, spread gel on Beth's growing belly and began the scan. "Let's see what we have here. Strong heartbeat, good position. Do you want to know the gender?" "Yes," they said simultaneously. "It's a boy. Everything looks perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, healthy development." Beth cried then, not from joy, but from relief. Despite the stress and poor nutrition and constant fear, their son was growing. He was strong. He would survive this, even if she wasn't sure she would. "Timothy," she said suddenly, "after my brother's middle name. David Timothy. So part of him continues." "Timothy Money Frank?" Jim suggested. "Just Timothy Money," Beth said firmly. "Your family doesn't get to claim him. He's ours, not theirs." Jim nodded, understanding. Their son would carry Beth's name, the name that meant struggle and survival and strength earned through endurance. The Frank legacy would end with Jim, and maybe that was the only victory they could claim in this war they were losing by every other measure. That night, as they lay in bed with Jim's hand on Beth's belly, feeling Timothy move, they didn't talk about the future. They couldn't afford to. The future was a luxury for people who had savings accounts and health insurance and families that helped instead of hurt. They had this moment, Timothy kicking against Jim's palm, Beth's breath warm against his neck. Her mother sleeping peacefully for once, and that had to be enough because it was all they had. "We're not going to make it," Beth whispered into the darkness. "Not cruel, but honest. We're making it right now," Jim whispered back. "Every day we wake up and choose each other. We're making it. That's not enough. Love isn't enough when you can't afford formula or diapers or a crib that isn't held together with duct tape. Then we make it enough. We make love plus determination plus spite equal survival." Spite. The desire to prove them wrong. To show them that their money and their power and their cruelty can't destroy what we have. That's worth something, isn't it? Beth didn't answer, but she pressed closer to him, and they held each other in the dark while the city outside continued its restless noise, and their son grew despite everything trying to prevent his existence. They were, as Jim said, making it right now. Tomorrow would bring its own impossibilities, but tonight they had each other. And that was its own form of wealth, even if it couldn't pay the bills. Chapter 8. The Inevitable Breaking. The contractions started during Beth's shift cleaning the 43rd floor of a bank building at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. She was alone, mopping marble floors that reflected her exhausted face back at her in warped dimensions. When the first real pain hit, not the practice contraction she'd been having for weeks, but something deeper, more insistent, a sensation that felt like her body was reorganizing itself from the inside. She leaned on the mop handle, breathing through it, telling herself she had hours before this became urgent. The baby wasn't due for 3 more weeks. This was just her body practicing, preparing, nothing to worry about. By 3, she couldn't deny what was happening. The contractions were coming every 7 minutes, regular as clockwork, each one forcing her to stop and grip whatever was nearby. A desk, a doorframe, the handle of her cleaning cart that contained all the supplies she wouldn't be able to finish using tonight. She called Jim, who was in the middle of his warehouse shift, and heard his sharp intake of breath when she said the words. "I'm in labor. It's too early, but it's happening." "I'm coming," he said immediately, and she could hear him already moving, telling Carlos something she couldn't make out. "Call an ambulance!" "Please, Beth, don't try to be strong about this." "Call an ambulance! We can't afford—" The next contraction cut off her words, forcing her to breathe in short gasps, while the pain rolled through her like a tide that didn't care about their financial situation. "Beth, call an ambulance now, promise me." But she didn't, she couldn't. $2,000 for an ambulance ride would destroy them. Would mean no food for a month, no electricity, no way to care for Timothy when he arrived. Instead, she made her way to the service elevator, rode it down to the lobby where the night security guard looked at her with alarm as she waddled past, clearly in distress. She made it to the bus stop just as the 3:15 arrived, the one that would take her most of the way home. The driver, a middle-aged black woman who'd seen everything this city had to offer, took one look at Beth and shook her head. "How far apart are the contractions, honey?" 5 minutes, Beth gasped, lowering herself onto a seat near the front. "Hospital's 3 stops from here. I can radio for—" "Please, just drive. I can make it home. My husband will take me." The driver muttered something about stubborn young women, but pulled away from the curb. The other passengers, night shift workers, insomniacs, people with nowhere else to be at this hour, pretended not to notice Beth gripping the seat in front of her, breathing through contractions that made her vision tunnel to pinpoints of light. A man in scrubs, probably heading home from his own hospital shift, moved closer. "I'm a nurse," he said quietly. "How far along?" 37 weeks, and that's full term. You need to get to a hospital." "I know." Another contraction hit, and Beth couldn't stop the small sound that escaped her throat. "I'm going home first. Please, I just need to get home." The nurse stayed close, timing her contractions on his watch until Beth reached her stop. He helped her off the bus, tried once more to convince her to let him call for help, but Beth shook her head and began the 3-block walk to her apartment. Each step felt like a negotiation with her body, a plea for just a little more time, just a little more strength. She made it to her building as another contraction crashed over her, forcing her to lean against the graffitied wall and moan through the pain. Mrs. Chen was somehow there. She always appeared when needed, like a guardian angel in orthopedic shoes. She took one look at Beth and began issuing rapid orders in a mixture of English and Mandarin. Her niece appeared, the nursing student who helped with Beth's mother, and between them they got Beth up the 3 flights of stairs that felt like Mount Everest. Jim arrived as they reached the apartment door. Having run from the bus stop, his work clothes soaked with sweat and warehouse dust, his face was wild with panic that he was trying to control. "The car's downstairs. We're going now." "Mom!" Beth gasped. "Someone needs to—" "I stay," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You go, have baby." I watch mother. The drive to County General was a blur of breathing exercises and Jim running red lights with the hazard lights blinking. Beth was in the back seat, trying to find a position that didn't make her want to scream, while Jim kept looking at her in the rear-view mirror with terror barely masked as concern. The contractions were 3 minutes apart now, each one longer and stronger than the last, rolling through her body like waves, intent on breaking her apart. "We should have called an ambulance," Jim said for the 5th time. "We couldn't afford it," Beth replied for the 5th time, then couldn't speak anymore because the pain had taken all her words. The emergency room at County General was exactly what Beth had known it would be: overcrowded, understaffed, overwhelmed by the city's endless supply of trauma and crisis. The triage nurse barely looked up from her computer, typing with the exhausted efficiency of someone who'd been doing this too long. "How far apart are the contractions?" 2 minutes, Jim answered because Beth couldn't speak through the current one. "First baby?" "Yep, you've got hours. Fill out these forms. Someone will call you." They waited 2 hours in plastic chairs, designed to be uncomfortable enough that people wouldn't linger unless they were truly desperate. Beth leaked amniotic fluid onto the cracked vinyl, while Jim held her hand and tried not to show his growing panic. Around them, the emergency room writhed with its own chaos, overdoses being rushed through, a child with a fever whose mother was crying, an elderly man holding a blood-soaked towel to his head. Everyone locked in their own private emergencies, while the fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent tune. When they finally got a bed, it was in a shared labor room with 3 other women in various stages of delivery. The curtains between beds were thin enough that privacy was an illusion. Beth could hear every moan, every encouragement, every moment of another woman's labor while experiencing her own. The nurses were kind but harried, checking on her every hour or so before rushing to more urgent cases. The anesthesiologist was busy with emergency cesareans, so Beth labored with minimal pain relief, some IV medication that barely touched the edges of the agony. "I can't do this," she said at hour 14, exhausted beyond anything she'd experienced, even the bone-deep tiredness of working while pregnant. "Jim, I can't. It's too much. I'm not strong enough." "You are. You're the strongest person I know." He pressed his forehead to hers, and she could feel him trembling. "You survived my family. You survived losing your job. You've survived everything they threw at us. You can survive this. What if something goes wrong? What if the baby, what if Timothy? He's going to be perfect. He's our son. He's already survived so much just getting this far. He's strong like his mother." The woman in the bed next to them screamed through her final pushes, and then Beth heard it, a baby's cry, high and fierce and alive. The family on the other side of the curtain erupted in celebration, multiple voices talking over each other in Spanish and English, joy that couldn't be contained by thin fabric barriers. Beth felt tears on her face, wanting that moment, needing it, terrified she wouldn't get it. When her time finally came, when her body decided it was done waiting and insisted on pushing despite the doctor not being in the room yet, everything narrowed to pure sensation. The pressure was unlike anything she'd imagined, like her body was turning itself inside out, like she was being split in half from the inside. She heard herself screaming and didn't care who heard. She felt Jim's hand in hers, crushing and being crushed in equal measure. A doctor appeared. Someone she'd never seen before, would never see again. Just another professional at the end of a long shift, and began issuing instructions Beth could barely process through the pain. Push when you feel the urge. Don't push between contractions. You're doing great. She pushed until she thought her body would shatter. She pushed until the world narrowed to nothing but pressure and burning and the desperate need to get this baby out. She pushed through exhaustion so complete she forgot her own name, forgot everything except the primal imperative to birth this child. Time became meaningless. There was only the cycle of contraction, pushing, brief rest, repeat. I can see the head, the doctor said. One more big push. Beth gathered everything she had left, which felt like nothing, like scraping the bottom of an empty well, and pushed with a force that came from somewhere beyond her conscious control. She felt the moment of release, the sudden absence of pressure, and then a sound that made her forget every second of pain that had come before it. Timothy's cry, high and fierce and absolutely alive. It's a boy, the doctor said, though they already knew that. Small but healthy. Good lungs on this one. They placed him on Beth's chest, this tiny warm weight covered in vernix and blood, slippery and perfect, and hers. He was so small, barely 6 pounds, but his cry was enormous, announcing his arrival to a world that had tried to prevent his existence. Beth wrapped her arms around him and sobbed, from relief, from exhaustion. From love so overwhelming it felt like drowning in the best possible way. Hi, Timothy, she whispered, her voice broken from screaming. Hi, baby. I'm your mama. I'm here. I've got you. Jim was crying too, touching Timothy's tiny head with one finger like he was afraid anything more would break him. He's perfect. Beth, look what we made. He's absolutely perfect. Timothy's eyes opened, Jim's eyes, that storm grey that had started everything, and he looked up at them with the unfocused intensity of newborns, seeing everything and nothing. Beth told him about his father, while nurses worked around them, cleaning and measuring and performing the routine tasks that seemed anything but routine when it was your child. She told Timothy about the night she met Jim, about poetry, and 3 a.m. conversations, and love that had survived everything designed to destroy it. Your daddy wanted you so much, Beth whispered against Timothy's still damp head. He was so excited when I told him about you. He loves you so much already. We both do. You're so wanted, baby. You're so loved. But something was wrong. Beth was bleeding too much. Could feel it pooling beneath her in warm waves that made the nurses exchange worried looks. They were pressing on her abdomen, massaging her uterus to help it contract, but the bleeding wasn't stopping. The doctor was called back, his irritation at being interrupted clearly visible until he saw the growing pool of blood. Retained placental tissue, he said, already calling for equipment. We need to do a manual extraction, now. What followed was pain that made labor seem manageable. The doctor's gloved hand inside her, scraping, searching for pieces of placenta that hadn't delivered properly, while Beth screamed and Jim held Timothy and looked like he might shatter from helplessness. There was no time for proper pain management, no epidural to make it bearable. Just brutal medical necessity, while Beth's vision grayed at the edges, and she heard someone saying numbers that meant blood pressure, and none of them sounded good. Stay with me, Jim begged, his voice breaking. Please, Beth, stay here. Timothy needs you. I need you. She wanted to tell him she was trying, but the words wouldn't come. The world was going dark around the edges, narrowing to a tunnel of light that kept getting smaller. She heard Timothy crying and tried to reach for him, but her arms wouldn't work properly. Someone was saying something about blood transfusions, about moving to surgery, about critical condition, but it all seemed very far away, like listening to a conversation through water. The last thing she remembered was Jim's face above hers, tears streaming down his cheeks, saying her name over and over, like a prayer or a poem or a magic spell that could keep her tethered to this world. where their son needed his mother and love was supposed to be. Enough, but sometimes wasn't. Chapter 9. The Shattering. Beth woke to the steady beep of machines and the specific quality of light that only existed in hospitals. Fluorescent and unforgiving, making everything look like it was dying a little. Her body felt wrong, heavy and disconnected, like she was operating it by remote control with a significant delay. The pain was there but muted, wrapped in whatever medication they were pumping through the IV in her arm. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw, and all that came out was a rasp that sounded like someone else's voice. "Beth?" Jim's face appeared above her, haggard and unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that came from keeping vigil. "Oh, thank God you're awake. You're here, Timothy." The word barely made it past her lips, but Jim understood. He's perfect. He's in the nursery. They're monitoring him because he's small, but he's perfect, strong, stubborn like his mother. Jim was crying now, touching her face, like he needed to confirm she was real. "You almost died, Beth. You lost so much blood. They had to take you to surgery, and then you wouldn't wake up, and I thought I was going to lose you." "How long?" 2 days. You've been unconscious for 2 days. 2 days. She'd missed 2 days of Timothy's life. The crucial first days, when bonding happened, when babies learned their mother's voices and smells and the particular rhythm of their hearts. "I need to see him. Soon, the doctor wants to check you first." "But Beth, there's something else." Jim's expression shifted to something she couldn't read. Grief. Fear, anger. "My family knows about Timothy. Someone from the hospital called them. Professional courtesy, or maybe they paid someone, I don't know. But they know." Before Beth could process this, could figure out what it meant for their already precarious situation, a doctor entered. Not the exhausted resident who delivered Timothy, but someone older, with the kind of confidence that came from years of delivering bad news. "Ms. Money, I'm Dr. Martinez. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck that backed up and hit me again." "That's not far from accurate. You had what we call a postpartum hemorrhage. You lost about 40% of your blood volume. We had to perform an emergency D&C to remove retained placental tissue, and you required 3 units of blood. There was a moment where we weren't sure." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're very lucky to be alive. When can I see my son?" "Soon, but I need to discuss something with you first. The hemorrhage caused some complications. There's a possibility. We won't know for certain without more tests, but there's a possibility you may have difficulty conceiving again. The scarring from the emergency procedure might affect future pregnancies." Beth felt something cold settle in her chest. Not grief exactly. She hadn't even thought about more children, could barely imagine surviving this one, but a door closing that she hadn't realized she'd wanted open. "Okay, we'll do follow-up testing in 6 weeks. For now, you need to rest and recover. You've been through significant trauma." After he left, Beth looked at Jim, seeing new lines around his eyes, deeper shadows beneath them. "You haven't left, have you? You've been here the whole time. Where else would I be?" He took her hand, careful of the IV. "Mrs. Chen has been watching your mother. My boss at the warehouse was actually understanding. Apparently his wife almost died in childbirth too. It's like a club no one wants to be in." A nurse brought Timothy then, this tiny bundle that seemed impossibly small and impossibly important. Beth's arms felt weak, uncertain. But the moment they placed him against her chest, something clicked into place. He was awake, those grey eyes looking up at her with the unfocused intensity of newborns. And Beth felt her heart restructure itself around this small person who depended on her entirely. "Hi, baby," she whispered. "I'm sorry I was gone. I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Timothy made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a comment on the situation, and tried to root against her chest. The nurse helped Beth position him to feed, and the sensation of him latching on was uncomfortable and profound simultaneously. Her body doing what bodies did, despite nearly failing completely. "He's been on formula," the nurse explained, "but he should remember how to breastfeed. They usually do. While Timothy nursed with determined concentration, Jim told Beth about the last 2 days. How Timothy had passed all his tests despite being small. How the nurses had let Jim do skin-to-skin contact when Beth couldn't. How he'd told Timothy about his mother, about poetry, about the life they were going to build despite everything against them. "And your family?" Beth asked, the dread settling in her stomach like a stone. "They came yesterday, my mother specifically." Jim's jaw tightened. "She stood right where you're lying and looked at Timothy and said he had the frank bones. Like that mattered, like bones were what made a person matter. She offered to pay for everything. The hospital bills, a better room, private nurses, if we agreed to give Timothy the Frank name and let them be part of his life." "What did you say?" "I told her to get out. That she'd forfeited any right to Timothy when she threw you out in the rain. That biology didn't make her a grandmother any more than it made Howard a decent father." He paused, and Beth could see him replaying the conversation. "She said we'd regret it, that we couldn't provide for Timothy properly. That love didn't pay for diapers or formula or medical care. She's not wrong about that last part. Maybe not, but she's wrong about everything else. We'll figure it out. We always do." They were discharged the next day. Insurance wouldn't cover more, and the bills were already astronomical. Beth could barely walk, moving like someone decades older, each step pulling at incisions and disturbing the delicate process of healing. Jim carried Timothy in the donated car seat they'd gotten from a charity organization, while Beth leaned on his other arm. The three of them moving through the hospital like refugees from some unnamed disaster. The ride home was terrifying. Every pothole felt like a threat to Timothy's fragile neck. Every sudden stop a potential catastrophe. Beth sat in the back with him, one finger in his tiny fist, watching him breathe with the intensity of someone who'd almost lost everything and couldn't quite believe it had been returned. Her mother was awake when they arrived, Mrs. Chen having positioned her wheelchair so she could see the door. The look on her face when she saw Timothy, joy mixed with grief for all the people who should have been here to meet him, made Beth cry again, though she was so dehydrated from blood loss that no tears came. "He looks like David," her mother said, her shaking hand reaching out to touch Timothy's face, around the eyes, the shape of his mouth. "I know," Beth said. "I see it too. That first night home was a revelation in exhaustion. Timothy needed to eat every 2 hours, and each feeding was a struggle. He was used to the bottle now, and frustrated by the work of breastfeeding. Beth's milk was coming in, making her breasts rock hard and agonizing. She was still bleeding heavily, soaking through the industrial pads the hospital had sent home. Jim tried to help, but he had to return to work the next night. They needed the money more desperately than ever. "I can't do this," Beth said at 3 a.m., Timothy screaming in her arms, refusing to latch, both of them crying in the dark apartment. "I don't know how to do this." "You're doing it," Jim said, though he looked as lost as she felt. "We're doing it. It's messy and hard and imperfect, but we're doing it." Mrs. Chen appeared the next morning with supplies, not new things, but items collected from other mothers in the building. A breast pump that had seen better days but still worked, lanolin for cracked nipples, a sling to carry Timothy while keeping hands free, frozen meals in containers that had been reused so many times the labels had worn off. "First baby is hardest," she said, watching Beth struggle to pump while Timothy slept fitfully in the donated bouncer seat. "Everything is new. Everything is scary. But babies are strong. Mothers are stronger. I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm falling apart. Falling apart is how you know you're doing it right. If it was easy, wouldn't be worth doing." The bills started arriving when Timothy was a week old. Not just the delivery and Beth's emergency surgery, but the NICU monitoring, the blood transfusions, the medications, each with numbers that might as well have been in foreign currency for all the sense they made. 43,000 for the surgery, 12,000 for the blood, 8,000 for the NICU, numbers that represented more money than Beth had ever seen, would ever see. "We'll apply for charity care," Jim said, staring at the bills spread across their tiny table like evidence of their failure. Payment plans, something. They'll garnish wages, take tax refunds. We'll be paying this off for the rest of our lives. Then that's what we do. We pay it off for the rest of our lives. At least we have lives to pay with. Timothy chose that moment to wake up crying, the particular cry that meant hunger, and Beth picked him up with movements that were already becoming automatic, despite everything feeling impossible. She fed him while Jim got ready for his warehouse shift, his body moving stiffly from injuries that weren't healing properly because he couldn't afford to rest them. The Franks would make this all go away, Beth said quietly, not looking at Jim. One phone call and these bills disappear. At what cost? They'd own him, Beth. They'd own us. And they'd never let us forget it, I know. I'm not saying we should. I'm just saying. She trailed off, not sure what she was saying, except that she was tired and scared, and the math would never work, no matter how many times they rearranged the numbers. Jim knelt beside her, his hand gentle on Timothy's tiny head. We chose this. We chose him. We chose each other. That has to be enough because it's all we have. After he left for work, Beth sat in the dark apartment holding Timothy and listening to her mother's labored breathing and the city's endless noise outside their window. She thought about the life they'd planned, a house with a yard, Jim reading poetry to Timothy, her mother getting better instead of worse. Instead, they had this, a baby who might grow up in poverty, parents too exhausted to be the people their child deserved, and love that was supposed to overcome everything but couldn't pay for formula when her milk wasn't enough. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Timothy, who was milk-drunk and peaceful in her arms. "I'm sorry we couldn't give you more, but I promise you'll always know you were wanted. You'll always know you were loved. That has to count for something." Chapter 10. The True Cost. It wasn't a bridge. There was no sudden cinematic collapse, no tearing metal, no spectacular fall into dark water. The thing that finally broke them was quieter, more mundane, and infinitely more cruel. It was the tooth. The wisdom tooth Jim had ignored for 9 months. The one he'd sacrificed for Timothy's ultrasound had long ago stopped being a dull ache. It had become a low-grade fever he couldn't shake, a constant throbbing pain he managed with ibuprofen he stole from the warehouse first aid kit because they couldn't afford a new bottle. He'd been working 3 tutoring jobs on top of the warehouse, his body running on a toxic cocktail of caffeine, sugar, and sheer spite. He was thinner, his face drawn, the soft parts his mother-in-law had worried about now completely eroded, leaving behind something brittle and exhausted. He collapsed on a Friday evening, halfway through helping Beth give her mother a bath. There was no drama to it. He just set the clean towel down, said, "Beth, I don't feel," and slid down the bathroom wall, his body folding in on itself. He was unconscious before he hit the floor. He was also burning up, his skin radiating a dry, terrifying heat. The ambulance was not a choice this time. It was a necessity. Beth rode with him, leaving a frantic message for Mrs. Chen, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. She watched the paramedics work on Jim, reporting a heart rate of 140 and a blood pressure that was plummeting. The words they used, sepsis and septic shock, were clinical terms for what Beth already knew in her gut. This wasn't an accident. This was an invoice. This was poverty charging its final, catastrophic interest payment. At County General, the same ER, the same plastic chairs, the same fluorescent hum. A doctor explained the reality with blunt, exhausted clarity. The abscessed tooth had been leaking poison into his bloodstream for months. The infection was systemic. His kidneys were failing. His lungs were filling with fluid. "We're inducing a coma," the doctor said, not meeting her eyes. "It's the only way to let his body rest while we flood him with antibiotics. But Miss Money, you need to prepare yourself. His organs are shutting down. The prognosis is guarded." Beth sat in the ICU waiting room while her husband, the man who read Neruda and had learned to load trucks, fought for his life against an enemy that could have been defeated for the price of a dentist's visit. She pumped breast milk in a cold, sterile lactation room, the mechanical whir-thump of the machine sounding like a clock counting down. She called Mrs. Chen, who reported that Timothy was fine, that Beth's mother was agitated but safe. "Go," Mrs. Chen had said. "Be with your husband. We are here." On the second day, Howard Frank appeared. He didn't look like a victor. He looked old and tired, and smaller than Beth remembered. He stood in the doorway of the ICU room, staring at his son's swollen, unconscious body, hooked to a ventilator that breathed for him. "I heard he was here," Howard said, his voice flat. "Get out," Beth said. She didn't have the energy for rage. She just had a vast, empty exhaustion. "He's dying. He's been dying since the day you threw us out. This is just the end game. I can have him moved." Howard stepped into the room, pulling out a checkbook. "Sacred Heart, the best specialists. I can pay for it all. The bills here will destroy you." "They already have." Beth stood between Howard and Jim's bed. "You think this is about money? You think you can buy him back now that you've broken him? He's not for sale. This is pride, Beth, stupid, childish pride. You're letting him die in a public hospital to make a point." "I'm keeping him safe," she corrected, her voice low and fierce. "Safe from you. You did this. Your obsession with values and backgrounds and strength. You wanted him to be tough. Look at him. This is what tough gets you in our world. It gets you dead from a toothache because you can't afford to be weak." She looked at this man who had everything and understood nothing. "He chose me. He chose our son. He chose poverty and honesty over wealth and poison. And I will honor that choice. I will not let you swoop in and play the savior now that your cruelty has run its course. Now get out of my husband's room." Howard looked from her to his son and back again. He saw something in her eyes, not fear, not grief, but a final, unbreakable resolve. He placed a business card on the table. "When you change your mind." He left. Beth tore the card into tiny pieces and let them fall into the trash. Jim did not die, but he did not, in the way the world measured it, fully recover. He was in the coma for 3 weeks. When he woke, the man who returned was different. The septic shock had deprived his brain of oxygen for long stretches. The man who woke up was Jim, but a Jim who had been sandblasted, his edges blurred. He knew her. He knew Timothy, but his short-term memory was shattered. The part of his brain that held poetry and complex ideas was now a room with the lights flickering. He struggled for words that used to come effortlessly. He had tremors in his hands. His honest hands now shook with a permanent palsy. They transferred him to the same state rehab facility Beth had dreaded, and the long, slow work of recovery began. Beth's mother passed away a month later, peacefully in her sleep. Beth held a small service with Mrs. Chen and Timothy, mourning a life of hardship and strength, and then she went back to the hospital. She brought Timothy every day. She took 3 buses, her body aching with its own fatigue, and sat with her husband while he relearned how to tie his shoes. Fog, he'd say, frustrated, pressing his palms to his temples. "The word, the thing, it's gone." "It's okay," Beth would say, guiding his hand. "It doesn't matter." "I know what you mean." "Timothy, safe?" "Timothy is safe. He's right here. He's walking now." Jim would watch his son, now a sturdy, serious toddler, stacking blocks on the rehab floor, and sometimes he would weep with a frustration that had no name. He hadn't just lost his past. He'd lost the ability to hold on to the present. They were married in the facility's common room a year after his collapse. Patricia, her old nursing friend, was the witness. Mrs. Chen was the photographer. Timothy, now 2, was the ring-bearer and held the plastic ring with grave importance. Jim's vows were simple. 3 sentences he'd practiced for weeks, his voice halting but clear. "I love Beth. I love Timothy. I choose this." They finally moved into a first-floor, disability-accessible apartment in the same building. Mrs. Chen had bullied the landlord. Jim qualified for disability payments, a meager sum that felt like a fortune. It meant Beth could stop cleaning offices and take a part-time job at a local clinic. Their life found its new rhythm. It was a rhythm of pill schedules and physical therapy appointments, and Jim's foggy days where he couldn't remember Timothy's name, only that he loved the small boy fiercely. The Franks' empire crumbled. Howard died of a heart attack. Wesley was indicted for the fraud Jim had sworn to expose. Their downfall was a footnote in the paper, a story Beth read with no satisfaction. They were just ghosts from a different, colder world. On Timothy's 3rd birthday, Jim was having a good day. A clear day? They had a party in the building's courtyard. Mrs. Chen made a cake, and all the neighbors brought a dish. Jim sat in his wheelchair. Walking was still difficult and exhausting, watching his son run and laugh. He had been writing, small fragments in a notebook, his handwriting shaky. That night, after Timothy was asleep, he showed it to Beth. "I don't remember the first night in the hospital. I don't remember the poetry I read," he said, his voice thick with the effort of communication. "But I made this for you, for Tim." Beth took the notebook. The poem was simple, halting, and the most beautiful thing she had ever read. "The words are gone, the bridge is down. I do not know the man I was, but I know your face, I know his hands. I know the choice I make each day. To wake, to stay, to choose this love. Again, again, again." Beth leaned her head against his, tears tracing paths on her cheeks. They sat in their small, cluttered living room, surrounded by medical supplies and second-hand toys. Outside, the city hummed its restless, indifferent song. This was not the life they had dreamed of. It was a life built from the wreckage, scarred and imperfect. Jim would never be the man he was. He would never be cured. Their poverty was a permanent, dull ache, no longer a crisis but a condition. But they were here. Timothy was sleeping safely in his room. Jim's hand, shaking but warm, found hers. "It's a good story," Jim whispered, not knowing if he was talking about the poem or their life. "The best," Beth whispered back, and meant it. They had not defied death. They had not conquered their enemies. They had, with grit and impossible endurance, simply survived them. They had lived, and in a world designed to break them, living and choosing to love again, 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 was the only victory that mattered. The end.